Frank Rodriguez had been looking forward to this day for months. His son Miguel was graduating from the police academy, and nothing could dampen his pride. At 62 years old, Frank's body carried the weight of his service in Vietnam, but his spirit soared thinking about watching Miguel receive his badge. The morning started like any other. Frank carefully pressed his old dress uniform, the one he'd worn during his 20-year career in the Army. The medals still gleamed despite their age, each one telling a story of sacrifice and honor. His wife Maria had ironed his best slacks and polished his dress shoes until they reflected the morning sun streaming through their modest apartment window. "You look handsome, mi amor," Maria said, adjusting his collar with gentle hands. Her eyes sparkled with the same pride that filled Frank's chest. "Miguel will be so happy to see you in your uniform." Frank nodded, running his weathered fingers over the ribbons on his chest. The Purple Heart felt heavier than usual today, a reminder of the shrapnel that still ached in his left leg when it rained. But today wasn't about old wounds. Today was about new beginnings, about watching his boy follow in the footsteps of service, albeit in a different uniform. The drive to the Civic Center took longer than expected. Frank gripped the steering wheel of his aging pickup truck, watching families stream toward the building. Young faces beamed with excitement. Older relatives clutched programs and flowers, and everywhere he looked, Frank saw the same mixture of pride and nervousness that churned in his own stomach. Inside the Civic Center, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage decorated with American flags and the police department's emblem. Frank and Maria found seats in the middle section, close enough to see Miguel clearly when his name was called. Around them, other families settled in, their conversations a happy murmur of excitement and encouragement. Frank noticed the man in the expensive suit almost immediately. Richard Blackwood stood near the front of the auditorium, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his manner suggesting someone accustomed to being in charge. As the ceremony's main sponsor and a prominent businessman in the community, Blackwood commanded attention wherever he went. His company had donated significant money to the police department, and his name appeared on plaques throughout the building. The ceremony began with the Pledge of Allegiance, and Frank rose with everyone else, his hand over his heart as he'd done thousands of times before. The familiar words brought comfort, connecting him to something larger than himself, just as they had during his years in the service. One by one, the new officers were called to the stage. Frank's heart raced as they moved through the alphabet, getting closer to the R's. When he heard Miguel Rodriguez, he couldn't contain his smile. His son looked sharp in his new uniform, walking with the confidence Frank had tried to instill in him since childhood. But as Miguel reached for his badge, something unexpected happened. Richard Blackwood stepped forward to the microphone, his expression stern and unwelcoming. His voice carried clearly through the sound system as he addressed the crowd. "Before we continue," Blackwood announced, "I need to address a matter that has come to my attention. We have someone in our audience today whose presence I find inappropriate for this solemn occasion." A murmur rippled through the crowd as heads turned, searching for the source of Blackwood's displeasure. Frank felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, though he couldn't yet understand why. Blackwood's gaze swept the auditorium before landing squarely on Frank. "Sir, in the middle section wearing the military uniform, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This ceremony is for police officers and their families, not for those seeking attention through military displays." The auditorium fell silent. Frank felt every eye in the room turn toward him, and his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. He looked around, wondering if perhaps Blackwood was addressing someone else, but the businessman's pointing finger left no doubt about his target. "I'm sorry," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't understand. I'm here for my son." "Your son?" Blackwood's tone carried skepticism and disdain. And you felt it necessary to wear your military costume to his police graduation? This isn't a veterans parade, sir. This is a serious ceremony for serious people. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he tried to process what was happening. Around him, some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others began to whisper among themselves. He caught sight of Miguel on the stage, his son's face a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "Sir," Frank said, standing slowly and trying to maintain his dignity. "With respect, I served this country for 20 years. I wore this uniform with honor, and I'm wearing it today to honor my son who's joining the police force." Blackwood's expression hardened. "I don't care about your service record. What I care about is maintaining the dignity of this ceremony. Security, please escort this gentleman out." Two security guards appeared from the side of the auditorium, their faces apologetic but their duty clear. Frank felt his world spinning as Maria grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with shock and embarrassment. "Frank, let's just go," she whispered urgently. "Don't make this worse." But Frank couldn't move. 20 years of military service, countless nights away from his family, buddies who never made it home, and this was how he was being treated. At his own son's graduation ceremony? The injustice of it burned in his chest like acid. "Please, sir," one of the security guards said quietly. "We don't want any trouble. Just come with us." Frank looked at Miguel, who had stepped forward on the stage, his face now red with anger. Other officers-to-be stood behind him, equally shocked by what they were witnessing. The whole ceremony had ground to a halt, and Frank realized that his presence was indeed causing a disruption, just not in the way he'd ever intended. "I'll go," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. "But I want everyone here to know that I'm proud of my son, and I'm proud of my service to this country. No one can take that away from me." As Frank began to walk toward the aisle, helped by Maria, who clutched his arm protectively, the auditorium remained eerily quiet. Some people looked away in embarrassment, while others watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. The clicking of Frank's dress shoes on the polished floor seemed to echo through the large space. Blackwood returned to the microphone, apparently satisfied with the resolution. "Now then, let's continue with our ceremony. These fine men and women deserve our full attention and respect." But as Frank reached the end of his row, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Near the back of the auditorium, a man in his 30s slowly stood up. His civilian clothes couldn't hide the military bearing in his posture or the steely determination in his eyes. "Excuse me," the man said in a voice trained to carry across great distances. "But I think there's been a mistake here." Frank paused, turning to see who had spoken. The man who stood looked familiar in a way that Frank couldn't quite place, but there was something about him that commanded immediate attention. More importantly, as this stranger stood, others began to rise as well, scattered throughout the auditorium like sentinels awakening. The man who had stood was Commander Jake Sullivan, though he hadn't introduced himself yet. His presence commanded attention in a way that couldn't be taught or faked. At 38 years old, Jake carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced impossible situations and emerged stronger. What the crowd didn't know was that Jake was a Navy SEAL, recently returned from his 4th deployment overseas. "Sir," Jake addressed Blackwood directly, his voice respectful but firm, "I believe you've made an error in judgment." Blackwood's face reddened at being challenged. "And who exactly are you to question my decisions? This is my event, funded by my company." "My name is Commander Jake Sullivan, United States Navy," Jake replied, stepping into the aisle. "And that man you just humiliated is wearing the uniform of the United States Army. He earned the right to wear it, and he's earned the right to be here for his son." As Jake spoke, more men and women throughout the auditorium continued to stand. They came from different sections, different ages, but they shared something unmistakable. These were warriors, veterans who had served in different branches and different conflicts, but who recognized one of their own being disrespected. An older woman with silver hair stood up near the front. "I served in the Air Force for 15 years, she announced clearly, "and I stand with our veteran." A middle-aged man with a prosthetic leg rose from his seat. "Marines, 2 tours in Afghanistan. This treatment is unacceptable." One by one, they identified themselves. Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. Young veterans from recent conflicts and older ones whose service dated back decades. The auditorium began to fill with standing figures, each one a testament to service and sacrifice. Frank stood frozen in the aisle, overwhelmed by this unexpected show of support. Maria squeezed his arm tighter, tears streaming down her face as she watched strangers stand up for her husband. Miguel remained on the stage, his expression now one of fierce pride rather than embarrassment. Jake continued addressing Blackwood, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as more and more people stood. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand you've contributed financially to this police department, and that's commendable. But money doesn't give you the right to disrespect a veteran at his son's graduation." "This is ridiculous," Blackwood sputtered. "I won't be lectured about respect by a bunch of strangers. Security, clear them all out." But the security guards remained motionless. One of them, a young man named David Chen, stepped forward and removed his security badge. "Sir, I can't do that. I served in the Army myself, and I won't be part of disrespecting a fellow veteran." The other security guard, an older man named Robert Hayes, nodded in agreement. "Same here, sir. My brother died in Vietnam. This man deserves better." Blackwood found himself increasingly isolated as his authority crumbled around him. The police chief, Captain Patricia Morrison, who had been quietly observing from the side of the stage, finally stepped forward to her microphone. "Mr. Blackwood," she said diplomatically but firmly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Mr. Rodriguez has every right to attend his son's graduation ceremony. In fact, as a veteran, he represents exactly the kind of service and dedication we hope to see in our new officers." Jake walked closer to where Frank stood, and as he did, Frank finally recognized him. Years earlier, Frank had been volunteering at a veterans hospital when a young sailor had been brought in after a training accident. Frank had spent hours talking with him during his recovery, sharing stories and offering encouragement. That young sailor had been Jake Sullivan. "Mr. Rodriguez," Jake said quietly, extending his hand. "Do you remember me?" "Jake Sullivan. You talked me through some dark times at the VA hospital about 8 years ago." Frank's eyes widened with recognition and wonder. "Jake? My God, look at you. You made it. You really made it." "I made it because of people like you," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You told me that service continues beyond the uniform, that we carry our honor with us wherever we go. You were right then, and you're right now." The crowd watched this reunion with growing understanding. This wasn't just about defending a stranger, this was about the bonds that connect those who have served. Jake turned back to address the auditorium, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Everyone here needs to understand something," Jake announced. "This man, Frank Rodriguez, represents the very best of what it means to serve. He wore his uniform today not for attention, but to honor his son, and to represent the values that should guide every person who takes an oath to protect and serve others." Captain Morrison stepped forward again, taking control of her ceremony. "Mr. Rodriguez, would you please return to your seat? We would be honored to have you here for your son's graduation." But Jake had a different idea. "Actually, Captain, if I may suggest something, Mr. Rodriguez served with distinction in Vietnam. Perhaps he could present his son with his badge. It would be a powerful symbol of service passing from one generation to the next." The suggestion sent a murmur of approval through the crowd. Miguel stepped forward on the stage, his voice carrying clearly as he spoke into the microphone. "Sir, with respect, I would be honored if my father could present my badge. He taught me about service, honor, and standing up for what's right. Everything I know about being a good man, I learned from him." The standing veterans throughout the auditorium began to applaud, and soon the entire crowd joined in. Blackwood found himself completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered. His face was red with embarrassment and anger, but he had no choice but to step back and allow the ceremony to continue. Frank walked slowly back down the aisle, but this time his steps carried dignity rather than defeat. The applause continued as he made his way to the stage, Maria walking proudly beside him. The veterans who had stood for him remained standing, an honor guard of respect and solidarity. As Frank climbed the steps to the stage, Jake organized the other veterans into formation. Without any spoken command, they moved into position, creating an honor guard that lined the pathway to where Miguel waited. These men and women, who had never met before today, moved with the precision and purpose that comes from shared training and shared values. Captain Morrison handed Frank his son's badge, and as he pinned it to Miguel's uniform, the emotion of the moment overwhelmed both men. Father and son embraced while the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the building itself. But Jake wasn't finished. As the applause died down, he stepped forward one more time, addressing Blackwood directly. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying authority, "I want you to understand something very important. The men and women who serve in our military and police forces don't do it for recognition or glory. They do it because they believe in something bigger than themselves. Today, you had a chance to honor that service, and you chose instead to demean it. That says everything about your character and nothing about his." The rebuke hit its mark. Blackwood's face went pale as he realized that his actions had been witnessed and judged by people whose opinions carried real weight in the community. Several prominent families in attendance began to whisper among themselves, and Blackwood understood that his reputation had taken a serious hit. As the ceremony concluded and families began to gather around their graduates, the veterans who had stood up for Frank approached him one by one. They shared brief conversations, exchanged contact information, and created bonds that would last long after this day ended. What had started as a moment of humiliation had transformed into something beautiful and powerful. The aftermath of the graduation ceremony rippled through the community in ways no one could have predicted. Frank Rodriguez, who had arrived that morning as a proud father trying to honor his son quietly, left as a symbol of something much larger. The story of what happened spread quickly through social media, local news, and word of mouth throughout the city. Jake Sullivan had given Frank his business card before leaving, and 3 days after the ceremony, Frank received an unexpected phone call. Jake's voice was warm but serious as he explained that he had been thinking about what happened and wanted to do something about it. "Frank, I've been talking with some of the other veterans who were there that day," Jake said. "We think what happened to you represents a bigger problem. Too many veterans are being treated like second-class citizens, and it needs to stop." What Jake proposed surprised Frank completely. He wanted to organize a veterans support network in the community, with Frank as one of the founding members. The group would focus on helping veterans navigate civilian life, find employment, and deal with the challenges that come with transitioning from military to civilian service. "But I'm just a retired soldier," Frank protested. "I don't have the education or connections for something like that." "You have something more important," Jake replied. "You have credibility. Every veteran who stood up for you that day did it because they recognized something authentic in you. That's worth more than any degree or business connection." Within 2 weeks, the first meeting of the Veterans Brotherhood Support Network took place in the community center. Frank was amazed when more than 50 people showed up, including many of the veterans from the graduation ceremony. They came from all walks of life, all branches of service, and all generations of conflict. The group's first order of business was addressing the broader issues that Frank's treatment had highlighted. They discovered that several local businesses had policies that discriminated against veterans, often in subtle ways. Some employers avoided hiring veterans based on unfounded stereotypes about PTSD or combat stress. Others simply didn't understand how military experience translated to civilian skills. Captain Patricia Morrison attended one of their early meetings, bringing news that surprised everyone. The police department wanted to establish a partnership with the veterans group to help with recruitment and training. Many veterans, she explained, had skills and experience that would make them excellent police officers, but the department had never actively recruited from the veteran community. What happened at Miguel's graduation was a wake-up call for all of us, Captain Morrison admitted. We realized that we haven't been doing enough to honor and support the veterans in our community. We want to change that. The partnership led to the creation of a fast-track program for veterans interested in law enforcement careers. The program recognized military training and experience, allowing qualified veterans to complete police academy training in an accelerated time frame. Miguel Rodriguez became one of the program's first mentors, working with veteran recruits to help them transition their military skills to civilian policing. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood found himself facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. The video of the graduation ceremony, recorded by several attendees, had gone viral on social media. The footage showed clearly how he had humiliated Frank and how the veterans had responded. Local news stations picked up the story, and Blackwood's business began to suffer as customers chose to take their money elsewhere. 3 months after the ceremony, Blackwood made an unexpected appearance at one of the veterans' group meetings. Frank was shocked to see him walk into the community center, looking uncomfortable but determined. The room fell silent as Blackwood approached the front where Frank was leading the meeting. "Mr. Rodriguez," Blackwood began, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology. I owe all of you an apology. What I did that day was wrong, and there's no excuse for it." Frank studied the man who had humiliated him, searching for signs of sincerity. What he saw was genuine regret and perhaps the beginning of understanding. "I've been doing some reading about military service," Blackwood continued, "trying to understand what I clearly didn't understand before. I've learned about sacrifice and dedication and the bonds that connect those who serve. I was ignorant, and my ignorance led me to hurt you and embarrass your family on what should have been one of the proudest days of your life." The room remained silent as Blackwood reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I can't undo what I did, but I can try to make amends. My company would like to donate $50,000 to your Veterans Support Network. No strings attached, no publicity required. It's the least I can do." Frank was speechless. He looked around the room at the faces of his fellow veterans, seeing surprise, skepticism, and curiosity in their expressions. Jake Sullivan, who had become Frank's co-leader in the organization, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood," Jake said carefully, "money is helpful, but what we really need is understanding and respect. Are you prepared to be a genuine ally to veterans, or is this just an attempt to repair your reputation?" Blackwood's answer surprised everyone. "Commander Sullivan, I'll be honest with you. My reputation has taken a hit, and yes, I'd like to repair it. But these past 3 months have taught me things I should have learned long ago. I've met with several veterans in our community, including some of my own employees, and I've heard stories that have opened my eyes to things I never understood." He turned back to Frank. "Mr. Rodriguez, you served this country for 20 years. You earned those medals through sacrifice I can't even imagine. Your son is following in your footsteps by choosing a life of service. What I did that day wasn't just disrespectful to you personally. It was disrespectful to everything you represent." Frank stood quietly for a long moment, processing this unexpected development. Around him, the veterans waited to see how he would respond. Finally, he stepped forward and extended his hand to Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, I accept your apology. But more than that, I accept your offer to help. If you're serious about supporting veterans, then we can put your donation to good use." The handshake between the two men seemed to release the tension in the room. Other veterans began to approach Blackwood, introducing themselves and sharing their stories. What followed was an evening of education and understanding that none of them had expected. 6 months later, the Veterans Brotherhood Support Network had grown into one of the most successful veteran support organizations in the state. They had helped dozens of veterans find employment, provided counseling and support services, and created a sense of community that many veterans had been missing since leaving the service. Frank Rodriguez had found a new purpose in his retirement. Working with Jake Sullivan and the other network leaders, he discovered that his experience and wisdom were valuable resources for younger veterans struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. The organization established a mentorship program, pairing older veterans with younger ones, creating connections across generations of service. The network's success caught the attention of state and federal officials. They were invited to present their model to other communities, and similar organizations began forming across the country. Frank found himself traveling to speak at conferences and meetings, sharing the story of how a moment of humiliation had transformed into a movement of support and understanding. Miguel Rodriguez thrived in his new career as a police officer. The accelerated training program for veterans had been so successful that it became a permanent part of the police academy curriculum. Miguel often spoke to veteran groups about the similarities between military and police service, helping others see law enforcement as a natural continuation of their service to their country. On the first anniversary of the graduation ceremony incident, the Veterans Brotherhood Support Network organized a community appreciation dinner. The event honored all local veterans and their families and featured speakers from various branches of service. Richard Blackwood attended as a supporter rather than a sponsor, and his presence was welcomed rather than tolerated. As Frank looked around the banquet hall filled with veterans, their families, and community supporters, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. What had started as one of the most humiliating moments of his life had become the catalyst for something beautiful and meaningful. Jake Sullivan, now a close friend and partner in the organization, approached Frank as the evening wound down. "You know," Jake said with a smile, "sometimes the worst moments in our lives turn out to be the most important ones. What happened that day at Miguel's graduation wasn't fair to you, but look what came from it." Frank nodded, watching as veterans from different generations shared stories and laughter around the room. "I learned something important that day," he replied. "When one of us stands up for what's right, others will stand up too. We're never as alone as we think we are." As the evening ended and families began to leave, Frank felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had served his country for 20 years in uniform, but perhaps his most important service had begun the day he was asked to leave his son's graduation ceremony. In standing up for himself and his service, he had helped create something that would serve veterans for years to come. The humiliation had lasted only minutes, but the bonds of brotherhood and community they had built would last a lifetime.